Greetings, listeners. You're listening to Colourful online and on DAB. A very warm welcome from me, Kenneth Tharp. I'm delighted to be back on Colourful for yet another interview related to the African concert series. Before I introduce you to today's special guest, let me tell you just a bit about the African concert series. The world's first ever African concert series was launched in 2019 by the award-winning Nigerian-Romanian pianist Rebecca Amodia, featuring 10 monthly concerts in various venues, including the October Gallery and the Africa Centre. Described by the BBC World Service as "The African Art Music Makes a Comeback," the programme of the series reflects the depth and diversity of what is known as African art music, the richly diverse genre of music which forms a bridge between Western classical music and traditional African music. And I'm pleased to say that in 2021, the series has returned for the third time. 3 of the 4 concerts that have taken place this year were streamed from the Africa Centre in Southwark, and 1 came all the way from the Cayman Islands. The next concert, which features the music of today's guest, will be streamed from London's October Gallery. Do follow the African Concert Series and Colourful Radio, as well as the Africa Centre and the October Gallery on all social media channels. Now, today's special musical guest was born in London of Jamaican parents. Her early musical experience included playing the violin in various youth orchestras in London and choral singing with local choirs in Newham. She is described as a composer, artistic director, conductor, academic, violinist, and filmmaker. And that clutch of titles alone will give you an indication of how special and how broad the talents of this person is, but it doesn't stop there. As well as being a visionary artist, my guest also describes herself as a cultural activist who has sought to use music as a tool for cultural change in society. After studying musicology at the University of Liverpool and then specialising in composition at Goldsmiths College, my guest's first major commission was a chamber orchestral work entitled Visions for the Greenwich International Festival. She is notably the first woman in Europe to have composed and conducted a classical symphony within the last 40 years. Entitled New Nation Rising, a 21st Century Symphony, the work was recorded and performed by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. My guest's music is performed all over the world. She's written theme music for television as well as film scores. In 1995, she launched and directed her own ensemble at London's South Bank Centre, made up of instrumental soloists, singers, dancers, and visual artists. She has composed for dance, for choreographers such as Russell Malafant, including the duet Push, in which the choreographer performed alongside the world-famous French ballerina Sylvie Guillaume, a work which toured to major venues in over 30 countries. She has composed for theatre. She has written operas. She's been commissioned to write music for royal occasions such as the Commonwealth Day, for the Queen's Summer Party at Buckingham Palace, and for the Queen's Golden Jubilee in 2002. She has taken huge influence both from Caribbean and African cultural heritage. Her work Mandela Tales was premiered at London's Purcell Room, and her opera based on the life of Queen Nanny of the Maroons premiered at the Tete-a-Tete Opera Festival. My guest is a music professor in composition and performance at the University of Westminster. She is in great demand on the board of cultural and arts institutions. She was the first female executive of the Association of Professional Composers. In April 2016, she was honoured with the Luminary Award presented to people of Caribbean heritage who have made significant outstanding contributions on an international scale. And most recently, she was awarded with a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Black British Theatre Awards. She has appeared on numerous occasions in the Power List of Britain's list of most influential Black people, and in 2019, she was honoured with an OBE for her services to music. And in spite of telling you all that, I have only just scratched the surface of the many accomplishments and the hugely varied artistic life of my guest. I am delighted to welcome on air Shirley Thompson, OBE. Welcome, Shirley.
Thank you so much, Sir Kenneth. How are you?
I'm very, very well. And more importantly, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your interest in my music and at Colourful.
Well,
I've been a fan of Colourful for quite a while, many years.
Thank you, Shirley. And I've been obviously a big fan of your music for a long time. And so it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you about your journey. But listen, I'm going to assume that our listeners, despite my introduction, will probably be really keen to know more about your journey. And I'd love to start by just asking you about your musical beginnings. What was your sort of introduction to music? What set you on the pathway for a musical career at a young age?
I've got no idea. I mean, I was always just very interested in lots and lots of things. I loved school, I loved learning. So school wasn't a chore for me. Learning wasn't a chore, it was actually a game, because everything I learned I was learning something magical. So I just loved lots of things, and I picked up a recorder first of all, and loved that in my infant school. There was a piano in a next door neighbour's house, and I remember I was must have been about 4 or 5, because 3 or 4, because I hadn't gone to infant school yet, and I used to go up into my neighbour's attic where the piano was, a little upright, and I used to be banging away on that, and it was magical just hearing this sound from the piano. So I can remember something being ignited then, and I can remember Christmas presents my parents would give me, musical stuff, just coincidentally, along with my other siblings. I can remember them giving me a recording. It was one of those little old-fashioned recorder players, and on it had Brahms' Lullaby on it, and I played it over and over and over and over again. So I just remember these particular points in my early childhood, where I was really I just thought music was magical, and also my parents played a lot of music in the house, especially on a Sunday was music day, and after church we would come home. What kind of
music did they play, Shirley? What kind of music did your parents play?
Yeah, they played a lot of blue beat music, as it was in the 60s, blue beat and ska, gospel, Jim Reeves, but really small. So they played lots of really wonderful mento music, soul music, and I remember we used to listen to music all day. It was always in the house. The house was full of music, classical music. My father would whistle Tchaikovsky piano concertos, and my mother would sing sort of gospel music from her church days. So there was a lot of music in the house.
That sounds wonderfully rich, and such a fantastic combination of musical influences, entering your consciousness at a very young age. The decision then to go and study music obviously was a more serious commitment, or at least I don't know whether you envisaged a whole career at that stage. Tell us about that moment when you decided to go and study.
Well, it was really tough, because I was equally good at history, and I really wanted to study geography, because I loved learning about the world and cultures and the physical geography of places. And I was equally good at those 3 things. And ultimately, I found a course that enabled me to take modern history, modern European history, which I'd studied at A-level, and music. So I went to Liverpool University primarily because I could combine my loves of history and music, and also because it was a musical city, and I loved the whole combination of the Beatles having really put Liverpool on the map with the music. And it was a great place to study music. It really had a long tradition of all kinds of music.
Fantastic. And then the decision to go on and to further study into composition, because you were a violinist at the start of your career. Is that right?
Really a musicologist. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with musicology. I did have some inkling about something to do with broadcasting. In those days, I didn't meet anybody who worked in TV or film, but from an early age, I thought something about broadcasting, but I didn't know what it was, because I didn't really know how people got onto television. It was all very mysterious, but I something with broadcasting.
And for anyone who doesn't know what a musicologist is, reminds me of Maureen Lipton. There's an ology in there. It sounds very grown up. What essentially is it's just the study of music in general, or is it more specific than that?
Yes, study of music. So the history, the harmony, counterpoint, acoustics. So I was glad to have taken a course that involved a sort of very comprehensive look at music as a science as well as an art form.
Yeah. Well, I suppose from what I know of your journey, and then obviously of your journey since then, what may have seemed like separate, not necessarily random, but separate bits of your story. But it seems to me that the history, the geography, your interest in film and sort of narrative, it seems to me as though they've all come together in various points, in various ways over your career, that incredible diversity of influences. And I think perhaps nowhere more so than maybe in what led you to write, a symphony, which I said in my intro. You were the first woman to compose and conducted, first woman in Europe to compose and conduct a classical symphony in 40 years. That's an astonishing achievement. And actually, whilst we're on first, I know there are a number of other firsts. I think you're the first person of colour to be a university professor of music, at least in Westminster's 150-year history, and probably in Europe. You're the first person of colour to have a full-length opera performed in the UK and in the West End, and the first woman to have written music for a major BBC TV series. I mean, the list is endless, Shirley, all these firsts. And they can seem inevitable, when one looks back. But of course, you were just carving out bit by bit your musical career. But please tell us a bit about the symphony and this new nation, this incredible title, New Nation Rising, a 21st century symphony. There is probably so much to tell about that. But please tell us some of it.
Yes, thanks so much, Kenneth. Yes, all these things have happened pretty organically, I have to say. The New Nation Rising Symphony came out, I was writing it at the time of the Iraq War. And we may not remember how desperate those times were when we thought we didn't know what was going to happen. And the world felt as if it was on a precipice. And at that time of writing, I really felt we needed some hope. And I just had in my mind that we were going to get a leader in the States that would not be so belligerent and would be a peacemaker. And in a way, I foresaw the rise of Barack Obama long before he actually became president. But that's how I saw a new nation rising, a new nation of world peace, really, is what I was thinking of. And a different way of approaching conflict, a way of dispelling conflict so that we could address our political issues in a much more peaceful way and conciliatory way. I actually wrote the music, the symphony for the Queen's Golden Jubilee 50th year as Queen Elizabeth. And it was such an honour to do this. And my commission was to write something that would represent the Queen and say something about her reign. And I thought, what better than to have and it had to be on behalf of London. And I thought, what better than to look at London's 1,000-year history. And I took as my starting point a book about a very small book about the history of Newham, where I was born and brought up. And this history started with the Norman Conquest, 1066, and brought us right to the present day. And I thought, well, how can I tell the history of London, not only of Newham, but of London in 1,000 years, over a 1,000-year period? And then I thought, hang on, why don't I use the symphony, which has using 5 movements of the symphonic form? Thereby, I need to pick out 5 periods 5 iconic periods in London's history. And then I could really frame it with the symphonic form. And this is how I came about using the symphony, because it was a useful format. And I was told I could use an orchestra, the biggest orchestra. So I thought, it's possible that I may be working with the Royal Philharmonic. So I had that in mind. And so I decided to use my knowledge of history, and I created in my mind the iconic what I thought were the iconic moments, 5 iconic moments in London's history. The first being London as a marshland and a farmland during the Norman times. The second being the Industrial Revolution from the 18th through the 18th and 19th centuries to the early 20th. The third iconic period, I think, being the First and Second World Wars. The fourth, really, looking at diverse London and London as a multicultural melting pot, which it was when I wrote the symphony in 2000, 1999, 2000 to 2003, I wrote the symphony. And then to have the London Symphony Anthem, which I was told needed to be sung by primary school children. So it needed to be powerful, but to be singable and performed by a wide spectrum of people, children and people. So that's how my symphony came about, with those things in mind.
No small ambition to tell 1,000 years of history in musical form. I think you've created such a wonderful introduction. I think we should listen to a bit. Shirley, do you want to say anything about the excerpt we're going to hear, or should we come back to it afterwards?
I'll say a bit about it, thanks, because I'm playing it because it's a movement that people tend to pick out. People tend to like it, and it's the second movement which looks at the Industrial Revolution. And for me, I pictured thousands of people coming down from East Anglia, from Scotland, from Wales, from Ireland, from all over the United Kingdom in the sort of 19th century, really, mid 19th century, and creating the roadworks, creating roadways, waterways, all the buildings that were being created at the time. And I just tried to replicate that banging. I just imagined the banging that was going on of all these buildings going up, and the sort of frenzy of activity that was happening in London during the Industrial Revolution, the factories, people going to work. But I also tried to reflect that the Victorians liked a lot of fun. They had loads of fun, even though they worked hard, loads of fun. And there's a section there where they're dancing to the music of the time.
Shirley, how wonderful to hear that. I think one of the surprises for me in that movement was the sound of the fairground. I hadn't expected that,
Yes.
but so vivid. But tell me, how do you, choosing how to start and end a piece of music, especially a symphony, I imagine is one of the biggest challenges. How did you choose to end? How did you make your choice about how to end this particular piece?
That particular movement. Well, I was thinking of the next movement. So location is very much about it. It's very hopeful. It's very full of energy, full of life, because I just imagine it was almost a renaissance, a London renaissance at that time during the Industrial Revolution. The next movement moves into war zone, and looking at reflecting on World Wars I and II. So I move into this sort of uneasy, the movement before the location becomes a little uneasy and restless at the end as it moves into this darker mood with troops going off to war and leaving their families at home to keep the country running. So I was really thinking in a narrative way, how am I telling this story?
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for that. Clearly, do you think of yourself as a Londoner first and foremost?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. London has definitely, as well as my Jamaican background, roots. So a real combination of my Jamaican roots and London and my Jamaican roots.
Well, let's talk about your heritage, because that heritage has fed into a number of pieces that you've made, and including some you've made documentary film based on your heritage. That was a real surprise to me, Shirley. Despite having known you, I hadn't clocked that you were a filmmaker as well.
Yes, I was trained at the BBC, and from the late 80s through to probably 2000s, I was probably known to people in the film and TV world as a filmmaker. They knew I did a bit of music, but I was actually, making films, attending independent film festivals, working. I worked for Rai TV in Italy, actually, making films with the BBC. So I was actually in the film world and the TV world quite intensely for about 15 years.
And apart from the fact that you have written music for television and for film, are there any other ways in which you feel that sensibility, an insight that you acquired as a filmmaker, feeds into your composition, or are they completely separate things?
Yeah, I certainly think they're comparable. The process I find is comparable. I create a structure which is quite architectural for both films and for music. So I think with big structures, how am I going to form it? What materials am I going to use? So yes, I do find the making of these art forms very comparable, and one has they've fed into each other pretty much. I was always thinking, how can I really synthesize picture and music into more of an art form? So not using music to assist the picture, but a true integration of music and the picture. So that was my aim as a composer. I was really trying to create real visual and sound structures that were interdependent. That was my aim when I made my first independent film, Memories in Mind. Women of the Windrush Tell Their Stories, where I included dance, music, was filmed on 35mm film, so very grainy, very, very, very powerful. So I was always trying to blend my history, my love of cultures, my music, dance, everything blended into everything with my work. And I love telling stories, so through music and through film. So perhaps it's my real interest in telling stories that haven't been told that has driven me to write both these works that I have written and stories that I've told in picture.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes, I think it's very clear, Shirley, that you're a storyteller, and I've seen that and heard that in your work. I'd love just to touch on and illuminate a little bit more about this notion of you being a cultural activist. Tell us about that, because that's not a label or a title or even that every composer would perhaps want to adopt, let alone adopt so, I think, naturally.
Well, it was attached to me, and I thought, what's that about? At the time, I didn't know what this was actually, cultural activists. And my friends that are politicians and sociologists gave me this title, and so I looked into it and realised that what I was doing in trying to democratise and assert other cultures into classical music from as far back as I can remember, meant that I was actually trying to assert other cultures without consciously knowing what I was doing. I mean, I'm aware now, but I wasn't at the time. So, for example, one of my early pieces, even when I was at Goldsmith studying music, I was inspired to tell political stories. So my first piano piece was called Sus, Suspected, and it was about the sus and people of colour being, especially men, were being picked up by police during the 70s and 80s, suspicious of criminal activities. And I was very I was very sad about it, and I thought the issue needed to be highlighted. And I thought, well, I can do this with my music, so that's what I did. And but I didn't think I was being a cultural activist. It was just something, I wasn't interested particularly in writing Indian abstraction, as it was very much so in the 70s and 80s of art music writing. It was very obscure, very esoteric. I was very much wanting to use my music that I was writing, and for it to be of some use, that it would be in some way useful.
Slight changing theme, Shirley. You've written a lot for the voice, both on the larger scale, with operas, and the smaller scale. And I know the concert that's coming up on International Women's Day will feature some of your vocal music. Is that right? And with the Nigerian American soprano Francesca Chegina. I'd love listeners to hear an excerpt of some of your vocal music, and I think we've already chosen the piece together, Precious Skies, featuring Yolanda Grant Thompson and Natalie Stewart. Tell us a little bit about this piece and about writing for voice.
Yes, well, considering that when I was at Conservatoire, it was very much about instrumental music making. So when I graduated to writing for voice, it was quite a surprise to me, and I'm not sure it all came about really. But when I set up my ensemble in the early 90s, I wanted it to be a real mixture of voices within the ensemble. So it was basically a string quintet, violin, two violins, viola, cello, double bass. I wanted it to have some kind of modern edge. So I had a kit drum, and a singer that could also be a spoken word artist. And this was in the early 90s when I was listening to a lot of sort of spoken word stuff, which wasn't really being used, adopted into the classical music genre, as you can imagine. But I was very keen on Maya Angelou, and people like Linton Kwesi Johnson was telling these very strong stories and political stories, and I wanted to use that element in classical music. And so that's why I had a singer and a spoken word artist that could become a spoken word artist. And so back to Precious Skies, which was a work much later. I wrote that in around 2000 or so, same time as the Symphony. Precious Skies looked at our world and how beautiful it is, and how we enjoy, it's great to enjoy the simple things in life, of walking out into the countryside and admiring nature and the birds singing and all that kind of gushy stuff, which was not really very, not the sort of thing we really talked about in our art music, and even in those days, it was all meant to be very much more serious. But that's what I chose to do. It's a melodic work, which wasn't very trendy either at the time. But my music was very much against the grain in being very melodic, and I used the voice in quite a contemporary way. And this is how, with a spoken word artist, which was very, very trendy in popular music, much more trendy in popular music and in spoken word art, spoken word circles. And I brought this into the classical music genre.
And how did you arrive at that particular title for the piece?
Precious Skies. Well, I just imagined walking through Hampstead Heath, which is one of my favourite places to have a walk, and just enjoying an afternoon in walking through Hampstead Heath, actually.
I'm surprised we haven't bumped each other on the Heath. Let's listen to Precious Skies.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kenneth.
Our hearts beat. Unified, they beat. Individual, they beat. How miraculous we are. How miraculous we are.
Brilliant, thank you, Shirley. It's so wonderful, hearing your music, having just heard you speaking about it.
Thanks.
One of the reflections I had before we went on air, Shirley, was just thinking about classical music and thinking about some of the hierarchies that I guess a number of people, yourself included, have been trying to unpick. The fact that it has perhaps been very white for a long time. But also, a genre dominated, I think, by men. One of my previous guests on this program, Chichi Nwanoka, who you know very well, was saying that most of the music she played for the first 30 years of her performing career were from dead white men. And most people would struggle to think of female conductors, for example. But on the positive side, what I see from my standpoint is some of our most established and distinguished classical composers in the UK, amongst them are some women of colour. There's yourself, there's Erilyn Wallin, there's Eleanor Alberger, and then perhaps some younger composers, like Hannah Kendall. And certainly, if we're putting colour aside for a moment, there are a whole group of female composers who are also coming to prominence. Like you probably know them better than me. I'm thinking of people like Tansy Davis and Lynn Plowman and others. How much of as someone who's clearly politically minded and socially minded and looks at takes inspiration from so many things, how conscious are you of being a woman composer as opposed to just a composer? Is that something that does color your perspective or change your choices, or that motivates you in a certain way, or is that, you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, or is it, no, I'm just a composer and I just happen to be a woman?
I was never, in studying music, in my classes, I was always the only woman. When I graduated from the University of Liverpool, I was the only person of colour in a whole faculty of art of, I don't know, 1,000 people. So, but I never really realised all these things until in retrospect that I was doing these things. So I've always just pushed on and done things. I wasn't aware of a predecessor who was a composer of colour or a woman. I latterly knew of Samuel Coleridge Taylor, but before that I wasn't aware. I knew of William Grant Still, because I'd seen his music in the library in the Victoria Music Library, but I hadn't actually come across anybody else of colour who's a composer before I started myself. I just thought that this is something that I was good at and I enjoyed doing, and people were telling me that I was good at it and I ought to do it. Now, it was very difficult because at the time only a certain type of music by certain types of people was being promoted, but that didn't stop me, because I'd read that all kinds of composers, Beethoven, Mozart, they'd all had their obstacles, and I was really thinking about them. All these composers had great obstacles to writing and getting their music performed. Joseph Benoit Chevalier, what a brilliant composer. And, so throughout history, and I'm a historian as well, composers have always had a lot of obstacles. So although I'm a woman and culturally Jamaican, as well as a London composer, I would not use those as, I use them as an advantage. And I just saw being a woman and being a woman of colour as an advantage. And I thought, look at all these advantages I have. And, if those silly people don't want to play my music, there are people that want to listen to it. And I was always thinking of the audience. And whenever my music's played, I get such joy from the feedback. And I just, the obstacles are there, have always been there and continue to be there, because that's how humanity is. And I think, you've got to have that confidence and that faith in yourself, first and foremost, because if you don't have the faith and confidence, then nobody else is going to have it. And I think, all these things have to come together. So I've just used my different cultural influences and my gender to inform my music, yes.
Well, it's wonderful to hear you speak about it, but it's also just wonderful to see through your art, through your music, which you do with such confidence and such assertiveness and extraordinary variety, to see that you're just doing it and creating change. And I think that really it does. I can see why you've acquired that label, cultural activist. Shirley, I must say, I know we may have talked about this years ago, but I'm going to remind you, the first time I came across your music was actually a piece of Russell Maliphant's. It was the piece Shift, which was, for listeners, was a solo choreographed and performed by the male dancer Russell Maliphant, in which over the course of the piece, and I can't remember exactly how long it is, Shirley, I think it's
15 minutes.
6 minutes, something.
No, it's 15.
It's 15. Okay. And it's for solo cello.
Yeah.
And over the course of 15 minutes, very, very carefully placed lights create shadows of the dancer on the backdrop. And at first you see one shadow, and then you see 2, and I can't remember how many we get in the end. I can't remember if it's 6. There's at least 3.
Michael Hull's incredible photography, and Russell,
yes.
his signature piece, yes.
Yeah, amazing. And I think it in a way that it was the synthesis of, which is a hallmark of Russell's work, but of music, dance, and lighting coming together in such a potent way.
Yes.
So for me, that was my introduction to your music, having then, I think, perhaps had the luxury of then tasting so many and still learning more about your musical oeuvre. It really underscores for me just what an incredible breadth there is to your compositional journey. We should definitely play one more piece for the listeners, Shirley. But before we do and talk about that last piece, I just want to remind people that the next African concert entitled African Art Song is featuring on the 8th of March, Monday the 8th of March, International Women's Day, or in celebration of International Women's Day, and it will feature rising star, the Nigerian-American soprano Francesca Chegina, and pianist Dylan Perez. And it will be streamed from the October Gallery. I think it's at 7:30 p.m. Please tune in, and you will hear some of Shirley's magnificent music. Shirley, if people want to know more about you and follow you, you're on social media channels. Do you want to direct listeners?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Kenneth. Yes, I'm on, my Twitter feed is Shirley JT Music. To hear my music, you could go to my publisher's website, and they are Deus Music, DEUSS Music. And I have my own webpage there, and it has my SoundCloud and lots of information about me. I'm also on Instagram at Shirley Thompson Music, and my website, Shirley Thompson Music, as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was just saying Thompson with a P for anyone who's not sure.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, fantastic, Shirley. So listen, let's lead into the last piece that we're going to play, which was written for a very special occasion, and again draws on your Caribbean heritage. This is the Psalm 84. Which was had a brilliant cast. When we were talking earlier, you mentioned obviously the brilliant soprano Nadine Benjamin, who many of our listeners I'm sure know, but also Byron Jackson, Ronald Sam, and Gwyneth and Rant, who collectively on that occasion were known as the Windrush Singers. But tell us about the piece it was written for Westminster occasion at Westminster Abbey. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. It was such an honour. I was commissioned the year before to write the piece. So the piece was performed in June, 22nd of June to 2018, which was 75 years after the arrival of the HMS Windrush from the Caribbean to the UK. And so there was going to be a celebratory service, which there was, on the morning of the 22nd of June, at which this was a special commission. It was an hour-long service to which the Queen, the Prime Minister, everybody was invited and attended. There was somebody representing the Queen there. But the piece was written, really, it's called A Psalm to Windrush for the Brave and Ingenious, because I see the Windrush generation as really being quite intrepid in coming from the Caribbean, people like my parents, my dear mother and father, who came to England, the UK, to build the country after the wreckage of World War II. And I felt that the Caribbean people, thousands of whom came, have worked so hard and made Britain the entity, the vibrant, colourful entity that it is today. And I wanted to pay tribute to them with this piece of music.
And you said at the time that you were writing that piece, which was over a period of time, you said that the whole Windrush scandal was sort of erupting in the background. That must have added a particular dynamic to the compositional journey.
Well, the Windrush scandal happened in the week of the actual commemoration at Westminster Abbey. And there was suddenly, my piece just suddenly became hugely significant, because before that, it was just going to be any other commemoration, but then it suddenly became headline news. And it wasn't before. It honestly wasn't. It was going to be quite a low profile affair. But the Windrush scandal really, sent it into the stratosphere. And everybody then wanted to attend Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of June. But before that week, it really wasn't, it wasn't a big commemoration. It wasn't it wasn't widely known. The Windrush generation wasn't widely known.
Well, Shirley, I think thank you for that. And I think this piece is a wonderful piece to end our conversation on, because it just embodies your, exactly, I think, who you are and how history and, the realities of our world inform your music and your artistry. Shirley, it's been an absolute delight to speak to you here on Colourful. Thank you so much. And we'll play out with a psalm to Windrush for the brave.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Such a delight to talk to you. And thank you to Colourful Radio for hosting me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley.